Good morning and welcome to this IDC webinar. My name is Anna Selbach, Associate Director for IDC Nordic, and today I'm joined by Mari Sturman and Zachary Palko from T-Systems to talk about digital sovereignty. Mari and Zachary will talk about the concept of digital sovereignty and some specifics about the most important regulations and of course also T-Systems various solutions. But before we get to that, I will talk about the case for sovereign cloud services. The reason we talk about, when we talk about digital sovereignty, we often think about requirements and regulations that we need to meet. However, the concept of sovereignty means that it's really about deciding for yourself what to do. So digital sovereignty is that the company is able to and has the ability to build the digital infrastructure as they see fit. Of course, within the technical boundaries, as well as the requirements, legal requirements, internal policies, and so forth. But when we talk about it, there's often a lot of focus on the data part. However, it's more than that. It's not just the data where it resides, whether it's portable, where it transfers to and from. It's also about the technical aspects. So what kind of infrastructure do I use? What are the different services that are used? It's all about the operational level and the assurance sovereignty we talk about. So it's all about how do we control it, who can access it, and on the insurance level, what are the workloads and use cases that I need to prioritize, and how do I support and execute and orchestrate these different ones. So when we talk about digital sovereignty, it really is an entire stack that we talk about. However, data sovereignty is what we'll talk mostly about today. And that is, of course, a key foundation, because that if you do not have the sovereignty in the data, if your data isn't compliant and so on, it doesn't really matter about what you build on top of that. The reasons that we talk about digital sovereignty and data sovereignty these days are multiple. One of them is that we see an increasingly complex environment with a lot of different regulations, a lot of them coming out from the EU, but also national requirements, other regional requirements, and of course internal requirements within organizations. And this is not, I'll not go into the specifics of this, but what we see here is that they are on, you can see that the different ones are upgraded or updated. So it's not just a matter of being compliant and then that's done with that. It really is you need to continue to be compliant with the existing rules and regulations, as well as comply with the new ones that come out all the time. As you can see here, it's not just about security, privacy, it's also about the digital economy. It's increasingly about things like AI and regulation about that. So really there are a lot of it's a very complex really environment that we are in compared to regulations. And that's also noticeable when we talk about whether or not companies are compliant. Only 17% say that they are fully compliant with the requirements that they need to fulfill today. However, we also see that more than half are in the process of implementing it or have implemented some of them, but not all. And the reason, of course, is this complexity that we see, where if you are compliant today, you may not be tomorrow, simply because there are new regulations coming out and because they are updated all the time. So it is complex, but it also shows that that there is a lot of things going on in this area, and that organizations are aware of this and have a strong focus on it. And some of the things we also see is that it is highly complex, and that's also why we still see companies lagging behind a little bit in terms of this. Another key reason that we talk about the digital sovereignty today is that companies increasingly shift to using cloud. And it's no longer just about taking a virtual machine from an on-premise server and putting it in a cloud. It really is much more about modernizing the application. It's about saving costs. It's considered a platform for innovation and a platform for ecosystem collaboration, and even considered a driver for cultural change. We see that several companies, they just implement cloud solutions because that is the way that they can change the behavior of users. It's the way that they need to, well, it's also new tools that they, for instance, need to embrace if they want to change how they do their entire development setup and so on and so forth. So really, driving change and being innovative and collaborating in a digital world is really where we see the key advantages of cloud today. Of course, cost also plays into the equation, but really it's much more than that. So companies can't really afford to say that we just don't want to go the cloud route, and we also see that virtually no company does that. Some of the things that really makes this even more complex today is that organizations, they don't just use one cloud. We see that about 70%, or a little more than that, they use both private and public cloud services. And if we look at those that only use private or only use public, they use multiple services, they use multiple deployment locations. So it's still not just a single platform that they need to manage and orchestrate. In addition, we of course see the entire architecture changing. As I said, it's not just a virtual machine or a single application. We talk increasingly about companies using serverless, they use microservices, they use containers, they use a lot of different cloud-native technologies to become more innovative, to become more agile, and so forth. And that really makes the entire compliance setup increasingly difficult, because if it's just a big singular application that sits somewhere and a database that sits somewhere, then it's relatively easy to at least understand where your data are. But the minute you start using different cloud provider services, your own applications, data repositories at the different locations in the company and externally, it becomes much more complex. And really, in order to be compliant, of course, you also need to be in control of the data and have proper monitoring tools and so on and so forth. So with that, we see a demand for what we call sovereign cloud services. And when we talk about sovereign clouds, it's not just a kind of a product or a solution that's just say this is a sovereign cloud. The point is that it has to be within a jurisdiction. It may be a country or within the EU, depending on the specific regulations that it is that you have the sovereignty towards. Also, it needs to have different kind of tools and the ability to secure that it has the right privacy control, it has the right access control, and all of these different elements. On one side, we see that the large cloud providers, they increasingly put some element of sovereignty controls in the services so that the users may be able to select where a specific data set resides. Is it only within a certain region, and so on. And the other end of the scale, we see that companies, they build their own private clouds. That does not necessarily make it compliant or a sovereign cloud, but at least that's often how companies have done if they want to have something which they believe or which they want to make sure that it is fully compliant and it is sovereign. They build it there themselves. But we increasingly also see both a demand for and also see more offerings from the vendors about what we call sovereign cloud services. And that may be third-party sovereignty controls that work in the public cloud. It may be that the use of these are fully outsourced or managed by the service provider, but it may also be a hosted environment with a dedicated infrastructure and so on. So there are a lot of different opportunities really to address this today, and more are coming up. And we also see that companies are very interested in it. And when we see the reasons for driving this is that companies want to be more secure. Of course, they also want to be compliant, but it really is the security element that most organizations emphasize. In addition to that, we see that it's about opening up to new markets, being able for a company to address a European market, for instance. They need to maybe have a sovereign cloud solution. Also, they need trust. So if the trust disappears, then the customers disappears eventually. So really, it's very business related. Also, it's not just a matter of being compliant and being secure. The complexity of this and the cost of this is considered the biggest challenges. We also see it's about extraterritorial data requests. So are there any organizational bodies that can require or any data depending on where it sits? But it's also the data itself. So is it portable? Is it classified? And so on. Companies may not even be at that stage yet, so that they are ready to this. They simply because they do not have the proper data management, data classification set up yet. So with that, I will hand over to Mary to talk more about the regulatory environment, and I will continue to look out for the questions and address them at the end.
Thank you, Anders. Okay, this is where my technology fails, and there we go. Okay, so sovereignty. When we think about that word, we think about kings and queens, dominance, power, control, the ability for a nation to govern its people, to know where they are, and within reason to control what they do through the enforcement of government regulations and laws. Data sovereignty in many ways is very much the same, except of controlling people. The aim is to control and govern the data belonging to those people by ensuring that data remains subject to the laws of the land from whence it was originated, not from where it resides. So the big difference here that many organizations will take for granted is that ensuring your data is secure and remains within the country of origin is your responsibility. So wherever that data or backup resides is not the responsibility of the cloud provider. It is actually the responsibility of the data owner. And this is the big problem that a lot of organizations are facing now, where we move more and more data into the cloud. So in the same way that GDPR or the UK Data Privacy Act imposes financial penalties on organizations who do not manage their data correctly. So for those that have exposed personally identifiable information visible within those cloud services, there is a huge, huge impact to many European organizations. I stress the fact of GDPR and the UK Data Privacy Act only because those are the two big regulations that impose severe financial penalties. There are two clauses within GDPR, Article 45 and Article 46, that will allow data transfer outside of the EU or the EEA. So if we look at Article 45 quickly, this is based on adequacy decisions. Now, adequacy decisions were around a long time actually before the GDPR was enacted. It's basically where governments look at the controls of different countries and determine whether those countries meet the privacy and security similar to those where they are operating. So you'll also see that obviously the United Kingdom is there listed. That is because we are no longer part of the EU, but all of those countries listed there have been assessed by the EU, by local governments, and they have been determined to be sufficient for data to travel into those countries without any further implications. If we take a look at Article 46, this is regarding appropriate safeguards. Now, what this means is in the event one of the countries that your data is traveling to is hosted from or has people accessing your data from. So for example, if you are using a cloud-based service and they happen to have a remote location in, say, India or Mexico for troubleshooting or incident management, then those people would need to make sure that appropriate safeguards apply to them. So these are things that are typically done as part of contract negotiation. So when you go into an agreement with your cloud provider, you need to ensure that you have legally binding contracts in place with them, binding corporate rules between yourselves and the particular organization in question, standard data clauses or standard contractual clauses that they are often referred to. These just simply mean how your data will be managed, how they will operate, and how they will protect you as an organization. The final thing I want to talk to you about is Schrems II. Now, this is something that affects all European organizations. It was enacted in July of 2020 following a ruling by the European Courts of Justice against a case between a gentleman called Max Schrems and Facebook. Basically what happened, Facebook was caught allowing the US government, Facebook being a US organization, to access the data of individuals. Now, those individuals had neither given consent nor agreed to their data being accessed by third parties. And because this was a US-based organization, the concern was that the US government would be doing something not necessarily malicious with that data, but simply because they had access to it. So Schrems II is a big, big issue. It affects all European organizations who use cloud-based services, specifically in the US. Now I say specifically in the US because it is just looking at the big hyperscalers, and we're talking about AWS, Google, Azure, the big hyperscalers that the majority of you will be using for your cloud-based services. Now, if we take a quick look at data sovereignty, as you'll see, or if you can remember from the original slide, there are very, very similar controls here. So control, enforcement, regulation. We talk about GDPR, we've just mentioned Schrems II. Standard contractual clauses, these are a huge thing that you will need to have in place to ensure that data sovereignty is met. Data protection, or DPIAs, so these are data protection impact assessments. These should be done and are required as part of ISO 27001, NIST compliance, GDPR, for example. They are standard requirements for all of those frameworks when entering into negotiations or contract negotiations with third-party cloud providers. Data privacy, data encryption, data governance. These are all areas where you will need to consider how is your data managed, how is your data encrypted, how is your data traversing the globe. Because when we're transferring data into the cloud, there is very, very little control that the actual end client, so you as consumers, have over the control of that data. Your cloud provider can effectively put your data anywhere within the globe that they see fit, and you have absolutely no control over that. The problem that we face is that obviously if your data is unencrypted, it is literally just sitting out there for anybody to view in the event that they choose to do so. There is nothing that can stop a host nation from obtaining that information. The only way that we can mitigate against that currently in the way that we operate is to use encryption. Encryption is not a new technology, but it is very difficult to maintain if you do not have the right technologies, you do not have the right operational teams to support that encryption, and you don't have the right skill set to manage it. T-Systems, as a global service provider, also suffered this problem, but we decided to team up with AWS to actually create a solution to our concerns, and that is something that my colleague Zachary will discuss with you now. So, thank you.
Right. Yes, my colleague Mari was talking about the importance of the legal and the contractual controls and the sort of the challenges what we face with the global hyperscaler companies and the data location questions. And my presentation dives into a little bit more on the technical details, but before we do that, let's have a quick overview of what are the overall measures that, for example, these systems are providing for companies to meet the sort of these requirements of higher data security and bringing the sufficient controls to the cloud. So traditionally, this was very easy because all the data was practically residing on companies' own data centers, but really the introduction of the cloud services practically broke the sort of the setup, and the solution what we bring to the market, this external key management, will be radically changing this. It's a game changer how we see it, and in the overall setup, we provide a foundation services that are targeting for building this kind of a trusted, secure landing zone And also the data residency controls. So how do you govern that the data is only residing in certain locations for geographical regions and legislative reasons? You might need to limit some of the data out of the certain regions. So you need to have some kind of control mechanism, intelligent control mechanisms. So how do you place the data? We also provide the cloud services from Europe for European clients, and this is also part of this kind of who is able to access what information that information stays even on the screen level where it is being processed, for example. We are also AWS Premier Partner. AWS has recognized us that we also provide these managed cloud services based on the highest security standards, and that's why we have this partner level status also. Then there is, of course, the whole universe of data confidentiality measures, what we can implement to the clouds, whether it's question about data in transit, data in rest, and there in particular, the key item, what Mari was already telling you briefly about, is this new service called external key management. And what does it mean for the customers? Let's have a look of that next. So when you have your own home, you are rather particular. Who do you give your keys to? And this is rather similar. So it's only common sense that you don't give your keys to just anybody. And same applies to the business as well. Many companies are struggling with their internal policies. Like Anders was showing that only 17% are fully compliant with their own policies and regulation that to meet the sort of the how do you control. And one of the essential items is, of course, handling of the keys. With this solution, what the T-Systems has been developing and the service what we can give to the customers, the encryption keys are stored securely outside of the cloud platform. We can also implement the similar setups and have been implementing, for example, similar setups for various other cloud services like Google. There are also this kind of unified communication services where we have been also implementing setups where the encryption machinery is residing outside of the cloud service as well. The key management is provided within the EU area. And what is extremely important, of course, for the use of the cloud platform itself is the seamless integration to the cloud services. This is without this, it would not be meaningful even to try this because you would have various other complications, because anyway you want to use the clouds for those new innovations and leverage the sort of the capabilities, whether it's about the new capabilities, scaling, or other kind of business model innovations what you want to leverage from the clouds. So let's dive in a little bit deeper in the sort of the how this has been implemented. On the left-hand side, you can see typical models and the service, this S3 bucket that is a very well-known service, globally visible service. And like Mari pointed out, it already itself opens a lot of questions that who can access the data, where it's available, and you can encrypt this, of course, your environment with AWS's own keys. Well, the challenge is if you are very strict with your own internal policies that of handling the keys, well, you hand it over the keys now to the hyperscaler. Well, how about then if you bring your own keys? That was one of the major improvements for the security what all the cloud providers implemented. So you can bring your own key. Yes, this is great. But still the problem is that actually the key is still stored into that memory of the of that KMS service. So you are still handing over the key to the hyperscaler. And likewise, even if you would use a third-party service provider, and their HSM solution for running the key services, you are still struggling unless you do the thing that what we implemented with AWS. So we have built this kind of a HSM cluster to our data centers, and the implementation means in this case that all the keys when they are going out of the HSM cluster, they are only transferred as encrypted data, and then those keys are processed in this external key management server proxy cluster, and that is seamlessly connected to the via integration to AWS's services. And double encrypted, this practically means that it's AES 128 double encrypted encryption applied there. So this is considered by the current computational means unbreakable with the current means. For the HSM itself, we use FIPS 140-2 level 3 certified infrastructure. So it means practically tamper resistant environment, and like I already mentioned, the keys are going in and going out of that environment only as encrypted items. So this is of course to meet the highest security level. Looking forward then, how to take then to the service into use. So some of the highlights I've been already mentioning, but the key server setup we have been building to Germany. There is a geo mirror also available in the Netherlands currently, and encryption keys are managed outside of the cloud. What makes it also very convenient for the users, this external key management service is also available in the AWS marketplace. You get also, you can connect these systems for practical aspects of like discussing your security needs and such through the marketplace as well. Or likewise, you can of course contact directly these systems. The infrastructure, it's highly available, scalable infrastructure, and utilizes dedicated connections for direct connections for high high capacity, as well as high uptime, as well as high performance. So when looking at the responsibilities, this is rather simple. T-Systems does it almost everything for you if you take it as this external key management as a service. But also this diagram actually shows very clearly that how the sort of the cloud providers' responsibilities are completely minimized down to the only providing, being responsible of providing the API for key management service. So T-Systems is responsible for vast majority of the practical duties of meeting this kind of security level. And of course, customer can enjoy the sort of the ready-made service. Of course, many customers ask me, do you have a reference customer? And yes, we do have one reference customer already who is willing to share. There is, of course, more customers who are using, but with them, we are working with Itonix. Itonix is a healthcare company in Germany. And as you can understand, this is the data they are processing contains highly important information for individuals, and keeping that securely stored and encrypted is of course essential for their business. The reason why they are, of course, using the cloud platforms is the speed and agility and the innovations what the cloud infrastructure can provide them. But to circumvent the problems, what Mari and Anders were mentioning about the cloud platforms, they can mitigate with our solution. Right. So I would hand over to Anders. You next.
Yes, thank you, Zachary. And please, if you have any questions, comments, anything, please just jump in. We have about 20 minutes or so at least to discuss this. So we'll break with some interaction. One thing, Zachary, I thought about here, you mentioned that in this case that it was to really get these speed, agility, and all that customers look for. And that they then, of course, used you for that, or to mitigate the security and compliance challenges. But do you typically see that it is actually the advantage of moving to the cloud that is driving the demand, or is it kind of a what we can call fear for not being compliant? Is it the compliance in itself, or is it more I know you probably can't separate them, but I think it'd be good to kind of
yeah. I understand your question. So it's a good question. So yes, we see customers who the speed of innovation is essential. So they see that they have been building, for example, their whole service around the clouds. Because this is like a sort of the evolution story. They started already earlier, and now they realize that, oh gosh, now the regulation is changing. So yes, they are sort of on that cloud. So how they can make their life easier and be compliant. Yes, that's one way of seeing it, that they want to be at the forefront of the development, leverage the clouds for the best. But then there is also we see a lot of this kind of insurance companies and also this kind of law firms who are still very much concerned about this kind of can they use really the clouds, because what will happen that if US says this or that, and what happens with China and so forth. So yes, there are different customers that and sometimes it's not that there is only one factor driving the sort of this kind of need for a higher security level. So it depends about the customer, but we can clearly see that some have very strong pull for the clouds, and but it's also a question about if your entire ecosystem of your partners and your business companions are already in the cloud. So you have always this kind of difficulties of how do you match those together with your services, unless you are utilizing the same foundation. Of course, we see that that many companies are actually using multiple clouds, and that brings an additional complexity. But yes, with the ready-made, like I said, that we have built similar setups for other hyperscalers as well, and their services. So those are not really a big hiccup. And ready-made service speeds up, of course, the deployment as well.
Yeah, I think we'll also come in some questions, comments about this, or which to some extent at least relate to this complexity. So for instance, where you have all of these different shared services in the cloud, combined with individual requirements from the specific company, it's not a clear question, it's more of a comment. So just again, emphasizing that this is a challenge, and that's more specific about the open source and IP integration. How do you, I can just maybe say one thing about that first, and then I can hand over to you, but how do you see open source and API integration with this setup and with this kind of encryption in the cloud? I think just as a general comment is that as it's the case with all open source and also other proprietary software, of that matter, really is that you need to understand what you need to understand a lot of the code behind it, and that you need to understand the application that you use for business critical purposes, even if it's open source. It may be you need to understand the quality of it. You need to understand the connections and so on for the data flows, what kind of data are encrypted within that application and so on. So that's a big topic in itself, I think, how to deal with it. But maybe, Zachary, you can say a little bit more about it specifically for this solution.
Yes, open source. I've been personally very much in favor of open source throughout my career, because I think transparency is one essential factor. Knowing what does the software do, and being able to see that that gives you additional insurance that you can go and inspect what's there. So that's definitely giving an extra advantage. Then also there is very hands-on item that when it's open source, there is and then if there is a healthy this kind of a support community, you can it's also further development exists. Of course, when it comes to the use of open source, of all the companies utilize this kind of additional services for if there is something urgently found that is missing from the security perspective, that you need to implement new functionalities or new capabilities as quick fixes, then the support needs to be there for making the security corrections to be available. But this is like a never-ending game of hackers finding new ways to circumvent, and new features are coming to the market. And yes, open source is definitely one of these kind of strong ones when it comes to the security. So
yeah, just we're already deep into as one of my slides showed, that complexity really is one of the main challenges, both in terms of compliance in general, but also specifically on sovereign clouds. And we'll talk a little bit now about some of the technical stuff. I'm sure you could continue talking for several hours, Zachary, about that.
Yes.
But I think also maybe we'll hear from Mary about a little bit more on the, say, business complexity in this, or a little bit more maybe the regulative part and not the technical aspects. I know you have some comments on that when we discussed this earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So from a pure compliance perspective, this whole regulatory situation, especially those regulations being imposed by the US on organizations who are trying to use the big three hyperscalers that are unfortunately all owned by the US, it becomes very, very complicated. Encryption is unfortunately going to be one of the sole solutions, quick fix solutions to resolving this. Obviously, compliance, you have certain regulations that require auditing. So, for example, 27001. GDPR, for example, nobody is audited on GDPR. No one comes in and says, okay, you have ticked the box and you are now GDPR fully compliant. It is an ever evolving regulatory framework, similar to the Financial Conduct Authority. It is completely evolving. It's never a fixed point in time that I've achieved that. So when we talk about how organizations can actually mitigate themselves from this fine, shall we say, let's call it a fine, because ultimately that is the risk, that we can carry on the way we are and everything will be fine. And one day a data breach will happen, or a host nation will access that data, whether intentionally or deliberately. And then that organization becomes legally obligated to compensate the frameworks for that data breach. The data breach in itself has numerous implications. So let's just take the UK, for example. In the event of any kind of data breach, you would have to go and notify the ICO. The ICO would then investigate your organization. Your organization then becomes either blacklisted by them, or you have to pay financial penalties. The same with GDPR. For a small organization, having a GDPR PII breach can literally cripple an organization there and then in one hit. So there are lots of compliance aspects that need to be looked at. So, I've discussed previously about standard contractual clauses, data protection, looking at the way that contracts are written and negotiated, ensuring that when you are going into contract negotiation with these companies, especially those that are governed by the US, that you have clear and defined agreements between yourselves and those organizations, that your data is secure, your data is safe. And in the event that a host nation, and let's just take the US, I know I'm making them out to be absolute evil people, and they're not, they absolutely are not, but they are a law unto themselves when it comes to the data that is operated and resides within their country. They take sovereignty to an absolute next level. It's in their country, therefore it is theirs. And the only way to protect it is through some form of encryption, some form of data pseudo-anonymization, so that that data cannot be read. And ultimately, as more and more organizations move their data into the cloud, this is realistically going to be our only option for securing that data. We can accept the risk. We can take the risk and say, let's not do it. Let's focus on other things. We have more important things to spend our budget on. But in the event of a data breach, that is going to be the one sole thing that will cripple an organization. Financially, reputationally, we can't ignore it. And the more and more regulations that come into place, the more difficult it makes organizations. And yes, I agree, especially with those that are operating in a shared service environment with multiple service providers, it is a very difficult situation. However, encryption across the board mitigates that regardless of how many service providers you have in place.
Yeah, and with that, that actually ties into one of the questions here, how these encryption and the key management solution, how that ties into the data sovereignty topic. And I think, as Olga said, we talked about digital sovereignty, really is a full stack. At the bottom, we have the data sovereignty, and the encryption is part of that. Of course, it's still about where the data resides, but if the data is properly encrypted, then you can locate, or you can the data can reside different places than if it's just if it's just fully open and non-protected. So that's how I think it ties in. But of course, it's a much broader thing. You can't just encrypt it and then say, well, we have encrypted data, so we are compliant with everything. It's a bit more complex than that.
That's why I was also presenting the wider picture of the sort of the, not just the sort of the diving into the sort of the details, but it's a wider question. It touches, of course, the operational items, that how do you manage the whole environment, who is in control of the software, what happens on the software level. And like with the Google Cloud collaboration, we have been going through the entire software stack there, because there was also a question that which hyperscalers we are working with. We have a data trustee model with Microsoft Azure. We have this sovereign cloud launched to the market with Google, and the AWS external key management is a new service we brought to the market end of last year, actually. So there is a whole bunch of this kind of data sovereignty related services what we have been developing and launching to the market. Our Microsoft collaboration started already 2016 with the launch of joint services, and it has been evolving since then. So there is long history already. But I see that the demand actually was woken up only in the recent years. So some of the more advanced institute or the more innovative forerunners are being, of course, taking these early in the use, and we've been trying to see when the sort of the real, the big demand will start to happen, and this seems to be the time. So,
yeah, just there's a question, a very specific one from for one of your slides, Zachary, about AIM policies. Can you give an example or elaborate on what you mean with that? I think it was on your slide.
AI and policies. I meant with the policies, company internal policy documents that usually state that if you work in banking, usually the sort of there is a demand not to hand over your keys, keeping the data secure, and such ones are there. So of course these are company specific ones. So yes, meeting those policies by sort of the you have to do some kind of a security exemption within your security organization to avoid being in conflict, and that's what I was referring to. So
then one question for Mary about whether you talked about the US. I could add, what about China? Or I could play the devil's advocate. Why should I trust? I know it may, from a compliance point of view, it's different with a European organization, but why should I trust a European organization more than a US organization, for instance? That's just kind of my own devil's advocate play here. But in addition to that, one thing is where the data resides. So for instance, a AWS region within the EU, it's still, the data is still handled by a US organization. How does that, whether the data is stored or whether it's handled by a American or non-EU organization, how does that differ, or does this solution apply to both aspects of this?
The solution itself applies to both, and regardless of whether the data itself is stored within an AWS or let's just call them a US hyperscaler organization operating within the EU. So they've got a data center, I don't know, in Italy. Let's just take Italy. They've got a data center there. The EU data resides there. It's irrelevant. The company itself is still US based. Therefore, by sovereignty of the US are entitled, the US government have full entitlement over that data of that US organization. Yeah, so it's irrelevant where that data resides in the world, the US or China. Let's take China as a complete diverse, answer. China as a country have full sovereignty rights over the organizations who operate within China, regardless of where that data happens to be stored. And that is the big key differentiator here, is that it makes no difference who you go into business with. It is the sovereignty of that nation that has the power over the organizations that operate within their countries. If you willingly give your data to a country that do not meet the regulations under GDPR, and we're specifically now talking European organizations who give their data to cloud organizations who do not operate within the bounds of the EU, you are automatically giving your data to that third party country. And that country has the right, in the event they need to, they should not, legally, they should not be just accessing the data because they see fit. There must be mitigating circumstances. Normally those circumstances are around legal. So in the event there is some kind of an investigation and they need that data for whatever reason, they should be then creating a law enforcement case, which would have a specific requirement for access to that data. They should not, and I say should very, very lightly, they should not just be accessing that data because they want to. However, we have nothing to stop them doing it. It is their data by sovereignty, and therefore they can if they want to, but legally they shouldn't be allowed to. In the case of Schrems II, and I keep going back to that because that is the big jurisdiction that broke everything. It basically, that one single case is the whole reason that we no longer have things like Safe Harbor or the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield itself was completely abolished as a result of the Schrems II case. Yeah, so that's the significance that we're looking at when foreign nations take control of data that does not belong to them, specifically when we're looking at the EU. The EU has created this GDPR, this massive framework to control and govern how our data is managed and how EU organizations should be able to manage and secure that data. And when third-party organizations or third-party countries come in and try and take control of the data they have no jurisdiction over, it creates massive, massive problems. So yes, I don't care where that data is stored. If it's yours and you are a US or a UK or a European organization and you voluntarily give your data to a country that does not meet the requirements for GDPR, then the risk is yours and you need to find a way to mitigate that risk. We are not saying that this is the be all and end all solution to fix that problem. There are multiple layers of control, compliance, regulatory, enforcement that needs to be considered to meet all the requirements of these main frameworks. Encryption is not the sole solution. However, it is one area to help you. It very much almost makes everybody go down a PCI DSS route, where you're looking at how is your data accessed? How does your data traverse? What is the data flow? Where is the bidirectional traffic? Where do we have demarcation points? So you've got encrypted data here, but does it become unencrypted at any point? This solution in itself is great. And I know I sound biased because I'm from T-Systems and we're presenting this solution, but it does give you end-to-end encryption. There is no point where that encrypted data is unencrypted at a demarcation point. That does not exist. The only people that have access to those keys are you as the owner of that data and T-Systems as the holder of that data. But even so, we will not do anything with your data because we have taken it on board as your service provider to protect it. That is then our job. And if we fail at our job, we are also implicated.
And Mari, what you said is very important, and also from the solution perspective, even if I was more presenting the encryption side, of course there is a question of how do you monitor the use of those keys, and the seamless integration, what I also mentioned, can safeguard that you have the complete visibility that how the keys are used. We also provide this kind of self-service portal for the customer to utilize to see that and process and manage the data, those keys. So you have a complete visibility. It's not just about the sort of the technical measures. You have to have also you have to be able to audit that everything is right as well. So and there we also help you with this like the sort of the you can use simply like if we talk about Google Cloud, it would be CloudWatch. You can use for tracking what happens with the keys. Right.
Thanks, Zachary. One thing I thought of now, we already talked about kind of that this is a small, or encryption is a small but important part of this whole data or digital sovereignty we talk about. But say if I should start somewhere, I know all companies are at some different routes and have need to comply with different regulations and so on. But is the encryption the first step, or should I go back to data management or data classification, or should I look mostly at the compliance part of the regulations and then see what do I need to do? How do I go about this? Where would you suggest that I start? What's the most important things to do? It's, I guess there has to be a reason for the encryption and
right
management department.
Well, in the Nordics, we have this sports called orienteering. So usually the best way to start is to know where you are. So first of all, if you don't have an initial understanding that what's the setup, make a clarification that where do you stand, and then it's much easier to select the direction you should be running towards. So yes, find if you have that baseline identified, that what are the measures what you have already in the use, then introducing the right measures, it's much more simpler and much more straightforward than running like in the woods without knowing where you are. Yes, to make it simple, for example, the encryption solution introduction, we can launch it in 1 to 2 weeks in this kind of for proof of concept purposes, and then the whole deployment takes roughly with considering all the discussions with the customer to agree how to set it up, and if there are some special requirements, it's usually roughly 6 weeks. So it's pretty fast to get into use, and you can also deploy it in all the European AWS zones and regions, as well as so it's rather simple to start. It doesn't mean that you have to have built an entirely new a cloud subscription or something. You can deploy it to the existing ones as well. So it's made very easy to deploy and to use. But like I said, that clarify things first and then start running to the right direction. So yes.
Thanks. We are approaching the not the top of the hour, as we're from 9:30 to 10:30 today. Are there any last comments from you, Mary, before any last thing that you would like to tell the attendees before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I think, you know, to summarize everything, just be diligent, do your homework, understand where you want your data to go, because ultimately when you use a third-party hyperscaler, regardless of where they are, you have no control over that data. You cannot tell that service provider where to locate your data. So you need to ensure that you have the best protection for your data, regardless of where it resides. And that's all about understanding what it is you're uploading, how you're securing that data, what level of privilege does that data have? Is it sensitive? Is it just normal data that you don't care anybody accessing? There are big differences to the level of data and information that you put into the cloud, and making sure that you have that protected is absolutely mandatory. There is nothing worse than finding out on the local media that you've had a data breach overnight and somebody has accessed your data. So yes, please start a program, look at what it is you're uploading, how safe is it for you for it to become public, and if it's not safe, find a way to protect it.
Thank you. I think
Anders, just brief comment. I've been typing some answers to the questions, so on the chat as well. Not managed to answer to every one of those, but yes, they are there. Which ones I managed to do between the answering other questions. So.
Yeah, and also, if you have any unanswered questions, please reach out to me or to Thomas or T-Systems directly, of course, and we will make sure that we get back to you and make sure that everything is answered. And with that, I will just say thank you very much for your time and for the questions coming.